So our topic tonight is responding in truth and love to gender ideology. And thank you, Paul, for the introduction. Let me give you a little background before we get started for how I got pulled into this. My own background is philosophy. I taught at Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland. I taught as a part-time at Franciscan University until my youngest was born. She's a little one with Down syndrome and she had some health issues. And I still teach to this day with the deacons and give workshops and have taught classes to the seminarians from the Diocese of Pittsburgh. So I have a lot of background in terms of formation. I've worked in catechetical offices with doing catechesis with both the Diocese of Pittsburgh and the Diocese of Harrisburg. And around the time of the decisions, the Windsor decision and the Obergefell decision, I was actually serving as a consultant for the USCCB on the Laity Commission. And every time we would meet, we would get a report from the subcommittee on the defense of marriage. And it was shocking to see the erosion in terms of how people understood the meaning of marriage, not necessarily coming from the individual people, but as a top-down, judicially imposed fiat, overturning, in many cases, elections where people upheld referenda, defending the meaning and very structure of marriage. And around that time, we began to see in some of the literature that there was some chatter around the edges about transgenderism. But at the same time, you would see people who are in favor of same-sex marriage kind of shushing the conversation. Not now, not now, not now. As soon as Obergefell was decided, so Windsor was first, Obergefell was second, right after that decision, when Anthony Kennedy included his famous clause about the, he had the famous comment about the meaning, you have the ability to decide for yourself the mystery of your own existence or something to that effect. And in the decision on same-sex marriage, he insisted that we needed to recognize or redefine marriage in order to give dignity to children. That was all that was needed, and from that time on, we began to see this whole phenomenon bursting on the scene. At the same time, because I'm watching this as part of my work for the USCCB, at the same time, I'm following different websites, and one day I happened across a GoFundMe for a double mastectomy for a 20-year-old woman with Down syndrome, whose mother was putting her through a gender transition. And I was so horrified by that because I have a daughter with Down syndrome. I know they have sensory issues. They're intellectually disabled. There's no way that someone like that could comprehend it. And from that moment on, I said, we're all in this fight. We have to be in this fight because very vulnerable people are going to be hurt. So with that as the background, I'm going to walk you through just sort of an exploration of the key questions on gender ideology and how to effectively respond to it. And I want everyone to keep in mind that when we're talking about families and individuals who are affected by this, these are, in some cases, it's a lot of kids in foster care. It can be very dysfunctional situations, but you would be shocked and troubled at the number of ordinary families that are dealing with this. So all it takes is a child being vulnerable, whether through social media, through past trauma, we'll explore all that. All it takes is some vulnerability on the part of the child, and there is just a cultural onslaught that really puts the child at risk for being susceptible to this ideology. So just keep that in mind. This is not sort of other people. These are your friends, these are your neighbors, they may be your nieces and nephews, they may be your own children. I noticed around 2017 or 2018 when I would speak on this issue, there was a remarkable change. I mean, prior to that, it was very theoretical. Around 2017 or 2018, every time I spoke, I would have parents coming up to me who were, by every appearance, by their questions, their demeanor, their apparent love for their child, excellent parents, but whose children had been sucked into this through school, through education, through social media. So that's the background. Okay, the usual disclaimer. If you want any slides, just contact me. You can go through Paul. But I don't like people grabbing photos, and then definitely please don't post them online because I haven't gone through to do the copyright violation. You have to mark every picture that you use, and I'm very heavily image dependent. And we can do that, but I have to run it through my office, okay? All right, so we're gonna go through some of these questions. Why are we here? Why do we have these transgender issues? Who am I? What's the answer, right? Like we give 2 different answers depending on whether you're coming from the perspective of Christianity or gender ideology. Does it harm children? And if so, how? How does it harm family, faith, and catechesis? What does the church teach? And what can I do? Okay, so that's our structure for our talk tonight. Okay, why are we here? Why are we here discussing this issue? Well, anyone who has been paying attention knows that there is a media narrative. And the media narrative is this, that if a child experiences gender dysphoria, in other words, a sense that internally their perception of themselves as either male or female doesn't match their body, right? A child who is in that experience needs to transition. And once they transition and are recognized as being transgender, everything in their life is solved, right? So this is a mother named Kimberly and her son Kai, who now identifies as a young girl, okay? And in this article, the article is How My Toddler Came Out as Trans to Our Family, a 2021 article. So the mother says to Kai, so when you think about the word transgender, what do you think about? And this is her son's answer. I think about rainbows and cupcakes with smiles and roses. Oh, that's so happy. Wow. Who could be opposed to that, right? But on the other hand, there is a dark underside here, the underbelly of this. And that it is this, that it's leaving in its wake devastated families, siblings, parents, aunts and uncles who feel like they're losing their relationship with this son or daughter, a broken family, and children with broken bodies that are directly harmed by medically and surgically transitioning. Now we can look to the example of Pope Francis, who was always so pastoral. And this is an image of a woman who identifies as a man, who is, goes by the name of Diego. And this woman wrote to Pope Francis and said, I feel very abandoned by the church. I don't know how I fit in, and I'm not even sure I feel welcome in the church. And so Pope Francis, who has a genuine heart for people who are on the edges or who are somehow marginalized, met with Diego for 2 hours in a private meeting, one-on-one, face-to-face, sat and talked. And afterwards, his words to us were, we need to accompany and never abandon them, okay? That's quintessential Pope Francis, right? And we hear about that all the time in the media. What we don't hear about is that at the same time that Pope Francis is insisting on personally accompanying the people who are affected by gender ideology, he's warning us about this ideology. And he has referred to it as a global war against the family. And in some conversations, he referred to it as the enemy of marriage and wicked, okay? Why? Why would he say that? Well, this issue touches on the truth of who we are, okay? And the fundamental questions we have to answer are this. Are trans beliefs about the person compatible with what we believe as a Christian? Can we hold both of those belief systems? And I will show you, it is a very different belief system. Are they compatible? And the second question that we have to answer tonight is gender affirmation or transition conducive to human flourishing? Okay, let's take the first one. Yes? I know, I tried adjusting it. Maybe if we move it, do you want to move it back, Paul, maybe? I think it's not fitting exactly. So move it, oh, forward, there we go, that's better. Okay, all right, thank you. Oh. How's that? Is that better? Okay, all right. I'll do my best. I'll try to project. I'll pretend I'm yelling at my 13-year-old. So, all right. Yeah, not that loud. If I use your middle name, you know you're in trouble. All right. Okay, so how do we answer this fundamental question? Well, Pope John Paul II in Fides et Ratio outlined that there are questions that every human being has to answer, okay? And in that encyclical, which is one of my favorites, I have a background in philosophy, he said, we're all, in a sense, philosophers. Why? Because we are tasked with answering the following questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What is the meaning of my life? And how shall I live? Right? And each of us has this built-in desire to seek the truth and to choose the good. So what's the answer that's given to us from Christian anthropology? Well, here is what our faith tells us about who we are. Who are we as human beings? We are created by God, male and female. We have our fundamental identity is to be a son or daughter of the Lord. Our dignity comes from being loved and created in God's image and likeness. We are created as an integral unity of body and soul. And our body has meaning. Our body is how we express this gift of each other to ourselves. We're able to express this life-giving, self-giving love. That's the whole essence of the theology of the body. This has implications for understanding marriage as a covenant, for seeing human sexuality as something that's essentially life-giving and love-giving, and for understanding what it means to be a family. We are inclined to sin, but redeemed by Jesus Christ. It's a beautiful, positive vision of the person. The Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us, and this was written in the 1990s, long before transgenderism was all the rage, everyone should acknowledge and accept his or her sexual identity. And I want to point out that phrase, sexual identity, because right now what our culture is insisting is that everyone has a gender identity. Your gender identity, as defined by Human Rights Campaign and other organizations, is your self-perception as either male or female or neither or both or some alternative. So it comes down to how you think about yourself. But that's not how we understand ourselves as Catholics, or as Christians, or even throughout the history of philosophy. We've never understood ourselves to be just merely mind, right? So by using this phrase, sexual identity, the Catechism of the Catholic Church is driving home the idea that you as a human being are created as a unity of body and soul. You are an embodied person. You're not just your mind. You're not just spirit and will. You are a person who is a unity of body and soul, both at once corporeal and spiritual. And we are created either male or female with equal personal dignity. What does science tell us? Science, what we can know through reason, tells us that every human person is either male or female. How do we know? Well, it depends on whether or not how your body is organized for reproduction. If you are male, you will produce small gametes, and if you are a female, you are the kind of being who will produce large gametes. Now, obviously, there are some people who struggle with infertility, but they still are the kind of being who would produce a certain kind of reproductive cell. This is determined at conception. It is immutable. It's in every cell. It's expressed in hormones, in your reproductive organs. It's observed in utero as well as at birth. We can isolate genetic differences by sex. We can look at imaging to see brain patterns differing by sex. And we know from the history of medicine that if we ignore biological sex, we are going to miss things. If you remember, the campaign Wearing Red for Cardiac Health for Women came about because women were dying disproportionately of heart attacks. Why? Because the symptoms were going undetected. Because previously, when people talked about heart attacks, they would talk about them with the classic male symptoms: pain in your chest, pain up and down your arm. With women, it's more like a feeling of indigestion. Holy cow, that is a really subtle symptom, right? But it's different from men, right? Why is it different? Because men and women are different. So we know there is a difference. Now, I want to be very, very clear. Everything that I talk about, when I talk about transgenderism in this lecture tonight, we are not talking about individuals with a disorder of sexual development, okay? Disorders of sexual development are disorders or defects that arise in the reproductive organs as a result of either some kind of congenital birth defect, whether it's a deficiency in hormones, whether it's a difficulty in how a gene is expressed, whatever it is. When we are talking about the transgender phenomenon in children, we are talking about children with a healthy body, okay? If you have a disorder of sexual development, it is diagnosed through lab work and through imaging. If you have a child who says he or she is transgender, there is no diagnostic workup for diagnosing it other than you ask your child, how do you feel? Do you feel like you're the opposite sex? And if they say yes, then the diagnosis is confirmed. So we're talking about two entirely different phenomena. Where did this come from? Well, the origin of the first split between these notions of sex and gender, and the person who really was pushing this idea was a doctor at Johns Hopkins named John Money. And he was a doctor who would work with people who, transvestites and transsexuals, adults, usually males, who identified as the opposite sex and were seeking treatment to masculinize or feminize their body. In most cases, feminize their bodies, right? And John Money had been working with these cases, but he was sort of looking around for that index case where he could prove his theory that gender was nothing more than a social construct and that biological sex was meaningless. And he happened upon the perfect test case. And this is written up by a writer from Rolling Stone named John Colapinto in a book called As Nature Made Him, right? And the story is the story of a man named David Reamer. David Reamer and his twin brother were both born, right, at the same time, and something went awry with the circumcision of David. His brother had a perfectly normal circumcision, but when David was circumcised, the cauterizing equipment incinerated his genitalia. The parents, who had only a high school education, were devastated. They didn't know what to do. So his mother was sitting there watching TV one day in her little house, a working class family in Canada, and she happened to see John Money talking about his work with transsexuals and talking about how you could take someone and socially transition them to live as the opposite sex. And at that moment, that mother suddenly had hope. She said, this is what we need to do. So she took her boys to see him, and John Money arranged for surgery to finish the job, to finish the castration, remove everything that was left of this little boy's genitalia. And he told the parents, go home and raise your son as a daughter. Never tell him about it. Tell everybody, family, school, everybody, this child from now on is a girl. And that is exactly what they did, right? So John Money began to write academic articles hailing the success of this experiment. And he would write things like, Brenda, that was the name they gave this child, she is feminine in every single way. She daintily extends her little finger as she sips tea and plays with her dolls. The reality was far different. The reality was this little boy never felt at home with the girls. He would get in fist fights with his classmates. His teachers didn't know how to handle him. And there was this deep-seated anger that he felt. And he didn't understand why. Finally, a psychologist in Canada told the parents, you need to tell him what happened. And the moment he was told about that, he reclaimed his sexual identity, there's that term, reclaimed his sexual identity and took the name David to symbolize the fact that he was going to succeed against all odds. But the end of the story is a tragedy because both he and his twin brother died of an overdose and he ended up committing suicide. He could never get past the damage that was done to him. But in the meantime, John Money continued to write articles about how successful his experiment was. So if you're wondering where this idea of the separation between sex and gender came, this is where it came from. And it's had consequences for our culture ever since. So what are we looking at? This is the new anthropology. This is the anthropology that is the logical outcome of John Money's separation of sex and gender. Here's what it looks like, okay? And I know this is a small screen, so it's hard to see, okay? The figure on top is a figure called the gender unicorn, and it has 5 categories, okay? And the categories are this. You have your gender identity. That's how you think about yourself. You have gender expression or presentation, how you dress, the clothes you wear, the mannerisms you adopt. You have sex assigned at birth. So in the ultimate act of oppression, The physician in the delivery room and the parents look at the newborn baby and slap a label on that baby and assign a gender. But the job of every young person is to find out who they really are, which might not be in accord with the sex assigned at birth. And only the child knows, regardless of how the body looks, okay? Then the other two categories are who you are socially attracted to and who you are romantically attracted to. The figure on the bottom, the genderbread person, is a graphic that the United States government hands out in the developing world to spread this ideology, right? When Pope Francis talks about ideological colonization, that's it. We go into the developing world where they need vaccines and they need antibiotics, and we're handing them the genderbread person just to make sure they're on board with our ideology. What's behind this? Well, it's a belief system that sees the person as essentially self-creating. Your identity is whatever you say it is. Dignity is no longer derived from your relationship with God, but it depends on everyone else validating this identity. There is no such thing as human nature. You're on your own, you are who you want to be. And the person is split in two. Remember with Christian anthropology, we talked about the person being a unity of body and soul, that you're embodied as either a male or female person. Here we have personhood equated with your mind, with your will and your desires. And the body exists as a tool or a canvas on which to project your desires to everyone else. So you modify your body so that everyone else understands how you identify. But the body has no more intrinsic meaning, okay? These graphics are available, downloadable, as coloring pages. And they are in every public school system, in a gay-straight alliance, any of these gender centers. This is what they're handing to children to say, and to young adults to say, figure yourself out. Who are you? Where do you line up? And it doesn't have to be consistent. You could have the gender identity of a woman, and you could have the gender expression of a man, and you could be sexually and romantically attracted to nobody. Maybe you're like struggling with just depression, or you're on medications that cause you to lose any kind of romantic or sexual interest. How do you make sense of yourself if you're a young person? Here's another look. This is the graphic that goes along with the genderbread person. And what I want to highlight on this is that one of the categories on some of these is anatomical sex, which equals what parts do you have. So in other words, if you're somebody who has gone through gender affirming care, say you're a boy and you've gotten breast implants, well, you actually have female parts, right? Maybe your sex assigned at birth was male, but there you are, you're on femaleness. So you must be a girl, you must be a woman, right? Because reproductive organs and secondary sex characteristics are divorced from the person and have no intrinsic meaning. And again, we're giving our young people a vision of the person that is disintegrated, okay? Disintegrated. What we want to help our kids do is integrate themselves so that they grow up with a sense of themselves. They're not disassociated from their bodies. They have this mature understanding of what it is to be a person, and instead we're disintegrating them. And the person disintegrates as a result. Everything here is a spectrum, nothing is concrete. So correspondingly, we're seeing a rise, dramatic rise, in the number of young people who identify as transgender. And they will say things like, I am a real boy, right? I am who I say I am. And everyone is expected to affirm, okay? So what we have here, and this is one of the downloadables, we have downloadables that are similar to this available on our website, or I'm happy to give this to Paul. We have two irreconcilable visions of the person. You cannot reconcile these two belief systems. You're either a unity of body and soul, or you're not. You either have an identity as son or daughter of the Lord, or you're self-creating. You cannot reconcile this. You either view the body as something that's intrinsic to the person and has meaning, where you're embodied from the moment of creation, or you view your body as something that is the ultimate instrument for self-expression, right? You either view sex, human sexuality, as something that's ordered towards life and love and exists so that we can give of ourselves to others, or you don't. And you see it as existing for pleasure and an activity that can either be solo or with others as you choose, right? And we could go on and on down the list. Absolutely irreconcilable. There is no way as Catholics that we can ever get on board with a graphic like the gender unicorn or the gender red person. We just can't. It is opposed to our faith. It undermines everything we believe. Okay? All right, but these kids are suicidal, right? This is what we hear. They need these transitions because if they don't, they will kill themselves. That is what we're told. That's what our kids are being told. Okay? Well, so in real life, how does this work out? Does it harm kids? How does it harm kids? Maybe it doesn't harm kids. Let's look at it. Well, we can see there's been a steady erosion over the years in terms of how we understand ourselves. This is the man who identifies, he doesn't identify as a woman, he identifies as a girl, which is terrifying, frankly, who met with President Biden in the White House, right, as part of some summit, and it was highly publicized. Herein is the form in North Carolina for changing your driver's license sex designation, and the only thing you need from that is a letter, and the letter doesn't even have to be from a doctor or a psychologist, it can be from a social worker, saying, yep, that's who he or she is. We see all of these cultural indicators that we're moving in a different direction. Here in church, I feel so bad showing this in a church, so I'm going to move past this quickly, but let me just say, your pride parade was filled with, I think, events that can only be described as grooming, right? Whether it's kids being exposed to drag queens, a child being encouraged to climb up on a striptease pole, right? We're seeing this everywhere. These would have been thought unthinkable 10 years ago. Not even 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Who would have thought that we would see drag queen story hour everywhere? And everywhere we have the influence of the media, schools, and medicine pushing our kids towards an outcome. TV shows aimed at children see a 222% increase in LGBTQ characters and stories in just 2 years. 222% increase. That is intentional. It's intentional. They're moving our kids towards seeing this as healthy and normal and a desired way of living their life. Social media, our kids are in the midst of a social media crisis where the more time they spend online with apps like Instagram and TikTok, the more likely they are to be depressed and anxious, and it's leading to their sexualization and their exploitation. We see, as we look, if you go online, one of the things you'll see is what can only be described, again, as apps that are grooming and normalizing transgender identities. So this is an influencer on YouTube who is asking kids, well, hey, you want to know how you know whether or not you're gender fluid? Well, think back to your childhood. How did you feel? What parts of your body don't feel right? And encouraging kids to rewrite their history, right? He's getting 98,000 and more views on YouTube from young kids going online who are trying to figure themselves out. On social media, you will find videos of girls who have transitioned, who have gone through a double mastectomy, and they make TikTok videos of themselves unveiling their scars and saying, free at last. What are they free from? They're free from the constraints of human nature. They're free from their body. They're not free. They think they're free. But that's what they're trying to achieve. You'll see people like this man here, who's one of the most sinister people online, who is an influencer named Jeffrey Marsh, who makes TikTok videos directed at kids who identify as trans or who are struggling or confused or feeling same-sex attraction, telling them, I love you. You're safe here. It's time to go no contact with your family. He's got 300,000 followers online. And when you read the comments that his followers post, it's always, I love you, Jeffrey. You make me feel so good about yourself. You're right, I do need to go no contact with my family. You're right, they're so toxic, right? They're just displacing it. In public schools, we see public schools being leveraged to promote this in every aspect of the school day. We've erased God from the public schools, and we're plugging this in as the new replacement way of looking at the person. So that they're in public schools across the country, and I really don't see any exception to this. Why? Because Lambda Legal has been going around filing lawsuits at any indication of any school backing away or trying to distance itself from it. We have LGBT inclusive cultures where we're giving boys access to girls' bathrooms, girls' sports, girls' locker rooms, girls' activities. We have activist teachers being recruited by schools. We have kids being compelled to use each other's pronouns. And all of these are in lesson plans and trainings that are being pushed in by the school district and by the NEA and some of these other major groups, and they're giving these trainings to everyone from cafeteria workers, bus drivers, teachers, up to the administrative staff. Everybody is expected to get on board. It is the new orthodoxy, okay? And I could go on and on. In the interest of time, I'm going to blow through these slides. We have all kinds of books that are read to young children, right? Books like this, You Get to Decide, The Gender Wheel, a story about bodies and gender for every body. When Aiden Became a Brother, right? All of them. I Am Jazz. I Am Jazz was the first one, but it's no longer the only one. And Scholastic magazine that comes home with your kids, if you go online, there's a whole section for ordering transgender resources for your child. A whole section. And if your kids are in the public school, those Scholastic books are in the library. I guarantee it. I guarantee it. That's what we're doing. We have books like Lawn Boy and Gender Queer, which can only be described as graphic novels that are pornographic in nature. I just, wow. We have, women's sports being erased. Why? Because we're allowing young men to compete in women's sports, and there's no way you can compete. I was a cross-country runner. There is no way I could have I was one of the better ones on my team. I could not have held my own against the boys. I could not. Maybe there were one or two who were sort of struggling. But all of the top 7 cross-country runners would come in before our first girl. Every single one of them. Every single one. And we were good. We were good. We were considered good, right? We have the case recently here in North Carolina where a male athlete severely injured a young woman, gave her a severe concussion with a laser-like spike to her face, to the point where the school district, God bless them, finally said, hey, we're not going to play you if you have that player because it's a safety issue. Well, no kidding. It took that. It took someone being injured. So it's being pushed in all over through the American Academy of Pediatricians. We have physicians who are encouraged to do gender screenings with kids, to ask them about how they identify, who they feel like, all of this. You know that time when they take your kids away and they talk to them by themselves? These are the questions. If you're not careful about who your pediatrician is, and if you don't know them, these are the questions they are being told to ask by the healthcare systems and by the American Academy of Pediatricians. So, how do we understand this phenomenon? Okay, I told you was sort of setting the stage for now discussing some of what happens with a medical transition. And in the past, the phenomenon of people males identifying as women, or children being confused about their sexual identity was not unheard of, but it was extremely rare. 0.002% of the population. So very, very few. So few that when a case came along, the physician would write an article about it, right? Like, oh, I had one of these kids, right? And very often it was attachment issues, right? And by attachment issues, it means that there was something in the family dynamic that went awry. And often through no fault, right? Like one case I read about was a family, 2 kids, boy and girl, close in age, and an older mother and a father, and the girl died as an infant of sudden infant death syndrome, and it devastated the parents, right? The dad sort of became very distant, the mother was inconsolable, and so the little boy, in an attempt to fix the family, declared he was a girl, right? It took a very experienced psychologist to tease out the family dynamic. And the reason why I mention that is because it's the classic example of a situation where it is not the fault of anyone. It's simply a child sort of misinterpreting the dynamic around him, right? Sometimes kids who have gone through sexual trauma will say they feel safer. I'm a girl who's been sexually assaulted, but I'm going to say I'm a boy because no one, the child believes, sexually assaults boys, and so I will be safer. And it takes a very experienced psychologist to decipher that. And that would have been the situation in the past. Now we're seeing a dramatic spike in the number of young people, especially females, who are seeking transition at clinics. And you can see this is data from the from the GID service, which is the gender service in the UK. The UK keeps great numbers because it's socialized medicine. So does Sweden. We don't. We keep horrible numbers. We lose track of kids all the time. So you can see this meteoric rise in the number of young people identifying as transgender. Okay, so what happens with quote-unquote gender-affirming care? See how the language has shifted? It's not even a gender transition. It's we're going to affirm the gender that you know yourself to be, right? See how subtle that is, right? It's very positive. Gender-affirming care, and who wants to be against affirmation? You have to be a horrible person to not want to affirm a kid, right? So what happens with gender affirmation? It is a four-part process, beginning with social transition, going through puberty blockers, which is using certain kinds of medications to pause pubertal development, then hormone therapy, where you give the individual cross-sex hormones, the hormones of the opposite sex, and then finally gender-affirming, quote-unquote, surgery, okay? Big medicine is all in. They refer to this as life-saving, as good, as evidence-based medicine, okay? Here in North Carolina, at your children's hospital here in Charlotte, everyone deserves to be their best, most authentic self. And so your gender clinic is offering them puberty blockers, hormones, and referrals to surgeons, okay? What do you expect at the appointment? Well, you have a 30-minute intake phone call to discuss your hopes for treatment. Following that, when you meet your care team, they'll discuss the journey, right? Listen to the language, right? If you brought a child in with a disorder of sexual development, they would get labs and they would do imaging. Here you meet with them and they discuss your hopes, your wishes, and the journey. No imaging, no labs, because you can't diagnose it. It's an internal wound that they're attempting to treat with medical care, okay? So, step number one, psychosocial transition, okay? This is billed as just an opportunity for the child to explore his or her identity, okay? Completely harmless, right? Well, no, not so fast. It's actually a very powerful psychological intervention because it gets the child used to rehearsing the role of being the opposite sex. They're trying on an identity and everyone is affirming them in it. And in the meantime, as they start exploring that identity, they grow more and more distant from their peers of the same sex, okay? It is not irreversible. Most of the kids, 90% of the kids who go through a social transition, I think the latest number of research from Jack Turbin at Harvard, who's one of the big gender doctors, was that 95% would go on to treatment. And he looked at that, this gender doctor from Harvard said, see, we're successful in identifying which kids are transgender, because 95% of the kids who we socially transition go on to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. Or an alternative way of looking at it is that it is an intervention that actually changes the child's perception of him or herself and induces the child to continue to try to pursue this mirage of seeking out treatment to really confirm that he or she actually is the opposite sex as he or she has been rehearsing, right? Okay. It is definitely, it's viewed as, again, a pause for exploration, but the fact of the matter is that it is a one-way path to medical transition with almost all of the kids going on to medicalized transition, okay? Medical transition, two parts, puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. Again, the claim with puberty blockers is that it is a pause. you pause puberty, it's completely reversible, and the child has a chance to explore who they are. And once they make that decision, we can either restart puberty, right? Or they can go on to cross-sex hormones. That's the claim, right? So it's just like timeout. We're just putting the body in timeout. No big deal. We do this for kids with precocious puberty. Well, children with precocious puberty are given puberty blockers because their body is revving into puberty before it should. And that can have detrimental effects on height, on sexual maturation, on how the child relates to his or her peers. You know, if you go through and start having your period as an 8-year-old, that's a problem, right? So a puberty blocker would be an appropriate way to try to restore health and balance to that child's body. But here, when we give these children puberty blockers, think about what happens, right? You take a boy or a girl and put him or her on puberty blockers, and all the rest of the other boys are going to go on and sexually mature. And all of the rest of the other girls are going to go on and sexually mature. And meanwhile, this child is in the body of a 10-year-old, right? They fall behind their peers of the same sex. And so it's almost a given that they're not going to feel like them. There's a gulf. You're creating this psychological and social gap between them because you're holding the child back from puberty. It carries risks to bones because puberty is important for bone development. It carries risks for long-term brain development. Why? Because puberty is a time when you organize, your brain begins to organize and mature. And we don't even know what these long-term risks are. The FDA just announced that puberty blockers in June announced that puberty blockers were associated with vision loss and brain swelling. I mean, these are not if you look at the lawsuits for Lupron from young women who have been on Lupron for precocious puberty, you'll see this is not without risk. 97 to 100% of children on puberty blockers go on to cross-sex hormones. And the combination of cross-sex hormones, which are intended to induce the secondary sex characteristics of the opposite sex, and puberty blockers, which prevents your reproductive organs from developing, will induce sterility in the child. This is a child who will never be able to have children. You've lost that window. And the typical age for going on puberty blockers is age 10 or 11. Okay, how about cross-sex hormones? Benign, right? We're just letting the child be who his or her authentic self is. Well, and the claim is that you become a new person. You feel so good about yourself. The fact of the matter is that your healthy body is going to be feminized or masculinized by large doses of opposite sex hormones, and it causes harm. It has effects on a young girl's voice. I can't tell you how many posts I've read from detransitioners, and one of the things they lament is their voice, because they no longer have a feminine sounding voice. Their vocal cords have been thickened by the effects of testosterone, and you never get that back. That is irreversible. Young women on testosterone develop male pattern baldness. Their genitals atrophy for both sexes, for men and women. Their genitals atrophy. Young women end up needing a hysterectomy. Why? Because their uterus atrophies to the point where it becomes physically painful. These have serious effects. Young women describe feeling rage when they go on testosterone, right? There are metabolic risks, cardiovascular risks, the risk of blood clots, long-term risks of an increased rate of acne, and we don't even know what the long-term risks are. Why? Because this is experimental treatment. We've never done this with children before. In fact, the protocol that they used, the Dutch protocol, was a protocol developed for adults, not for children. And as the Dutch have backed away from it, all of the international, the other nations have backed away from this because they're like, this isn't working out so well. They're all on socialized medicine so they can see the results. They're backing away from it, and the Dutch have disavowed this protocol. They're saying it's being used in the United States in ways that we didn't intend, okay? Following that, the child is still chasing a mirage. So what happens after going on cross-sex hormones? Well, you still have parts of your body that remind you of what your sex really is. And so that's what impels these children, these young adults, in some cases as young as 13, to go on and pursue surgery. You go on to GoFundMe, you can find over 40,000 young women begging for people to fund their double mastectomy. Over 40,000 at any given time. Hi, I'm Kai, and I need a double mastectomy, and I'd really, really appreciate it if you could donate. It's the most heartbreaking thing you'll ever see, okay? Okay. What are the surgeries? Double mastectomy for young women, hysterectomy, genital surgery for young women. They remove the female reproductive organs, and they attempt to fashion a facsimile of male reproductive organs. For young men, they split open their reproductive organs, push them inside to create a neovagina. It is absolutely, absolutely barbaric. We are sterilizing and castrating these children surgically. And they will never be able to get back that function. The complication rate is unbelievable, unbelievable. I have one, let's see, do I have it here? I might have it here. I don't know if I have it here. But I have a slide that I used earlier today from a physician who does gender affirming care, and he does surgeries on young women and young men. And in this slide, which I took from a slide for gender affirming care, they said, this doctor said, I tell everyone the complication rate for phalloplasty is 100%. You have to expect complications. What? Is there any other procedure that has a 100% complication rate that we're doing? Are you kidding? And these can be serious complications. Unbelievable. Here's a chart by one of the major gender doctors, Johanna Olsen Kennedy from out in Los Angeles. And this is one of her research articles. Age at chest surgery, that's a euphemism for double mastectomy, in the post-surgical cohort. Look at that, she did 2 double mastectomies for this research study. She did 2 on 13-year-old girls. Look at that. Most of them are 18 or younger. Holy cow. Okay. Here in Charlotte, if you go on to Charlotte Trans Health, they have referrals to various doctors. I obscured the names of the doctors here. It doesn't really matter because all of their doctors do this. And if you look, it's hard to see, ages served at the bottom, youth 14 to 17. So when people tell you that gender surgeries are not done on minors, that is absolutely flat out contradicted by their own websites. They are offering this care to 14-year-olds, and in some cases, even younger. There's a physician from Children's Hospital in Philadelphia who, in her testimony to the Pennsylvania State House, said, well, age is just a number. Age is just a number, of course. This is the reality of what it looks like. This is a young woman who had a phalloplasty, and it's hard to see because of the size of this screen, but her arm, they peeled off her arm, and so she has to massage her hand to try to drain fluids out of it, and she has this disfigured arm with a scar right there from where they peeled it apart to try to create what would look like male genitalia. Here are 2 cousins. I obscured their double mastectomy, but 2 cousins, they do everything together, even their gender transition. Look at how lost and young they look. Someone performed a double mastectomy on those 2 young girls. Who would do that? Well, we know who. There's a doctor in Miami who posts TikTok videos of the double mastectomies she does. And here's a mother who, I don't even know what psychological issues that mother has, because who would do this to her child? She's there posing with her daughter who has just had her breast removed, and there's the sibling, and it's hard for me to even tell if that's a young boy or a young girl, clutching a teddy bear, legs crossed, and turned away from the group. Like, hello, there's a lot wrong with this picture, even down to how this child is reacting. That child knows there's something wrong here, right? They're posting this on TikTok videos, and kids see these TikTok videos, and they will write into the surgeon, I want you to do my double mastectomy. You are so cool. You're so awesome. Because she's creating this social media persona. Here's testimony from a lawsuit against the NHS by a young man in the UK, a civil servant from Newcastle, who describes how devastated his body is. He said his whole pelvic area feels numb. It takes him 10 minutes to go to the bathroom, and he still urinates all over himself from the surgery. He is shell-shocked from the damage done to him by the care at the NHS. And he says, my first thought as I came around was, oh God, what have I done? And in his testimony in this lawsuit, he said not one single professional explored whether he had underlying mental health issues that should have been treated first. This is the reality. And I hate doing this in a church, but you know, our Lord was broken and wounded on the cross too, so God forgive us as a country for what we're doing. Here's this doctor from Miami. Just realized I only get to yeet 4 teats next week. That's how she flippantly refers to doing a double mastectomy. We're gonna yeet the teats. Oh, this is so much fun. Oh, look at this, kids, right? Here's a gender doctor in Canada posing at Christmas time as Santa Claus carrying away the buckets of breast tissue after doing a mastectomy. This is horrifying. We cannot go along with this. We cannot go along with this. It not only goes against everything we believe about the person, but even as a human rights issue, these are vulnerable children whose bodies are being mutilated. And I'm not even going to show this picture in here, except that last picture that I zipped by because we're in a church, I don't want to show it, is a picture of someone who posed with that doctor, and in the picture you can see the child's scars from when she was cutting herself. So here's a young girl who comes for double mastectomy, and she has scars from all the time she was self-harming, and they still performed the operation. Who would do that? Well, the claim is that you need to do this because this is a young person who will commit suicide. And so they will tell parents, I feel so sorry for parents whose kids are pulled into this, because they are manipulated by the rhetoric that is used. They will tell these parents, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? I can't imagine anything more manipulative. And they will tell them, if you don't affirm and permit the transition, your child is at risk for suicide. Well, not so fast, because this individual here, Laura Edwards-Leeper, is someone who helped start the first gender clinic. And last year, as she was realizing the scale of the devastation, she's one of the gender doctors. She is not on our side, believe me. But even she is backing away and saying, you know, maybe we should ramp down the suicide talk, because there is no evidence that if teens don't transition, that they will commit suicide. Now, we have to be very careful, because this is a population as a whole that is at risk for suicide because of their underlying mental health issues. 88% of these kids have been diagnosed with mental health issues before they come into that gender clinic. ADHD, depression, anxiety, sexual trauma. 33% of these kids are on the autistic spectrum. 33% of them. So they have things that make them vulnerable to this, right? They've got these mental health issues, and these mental health issues are issues that can put them at risk for anxiety and depression. But when you actually look at whether or not these kids are committing suicide, if they're not affirmed, well, actually, they're not. How do we know? Again, we go to the UK, and you can see, based on data from the world's largest clinic for transgender youth ages 11 and older, that deaths were remarkably rare, only 0.03%, much smaller than we think, right? These are kids who were waiting to be seen by the gender clinic for years, because it's the UK and it's socialized medicine, and it's hard to get into a doctor, and they've had an explosion of children seeking care. And so the conclusion of this researcher, Michael Biggs, was that it is irresponsible to exaggerate the prevalence of suicide. Why is it irresponsible? Not only because it's manipulative to the families, but because children themselves hear these statistics and become very afraid. And they think, I have to go through with this, or I will commit suicide. And we know this because this is what a number of the young people who have detransitioned have told us. Okay, so what makes a child vulnerable to this? Okay, well, there's a researcher named Lisa Littman from Brown University who identified certain vulnerabilities that make young girls in particular vulnerable for what she referred to as rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is the term used to describe the sharp increase in teen girls who identify as transgender. What are the underlying vulnerabilities? Mental illness, huge, 88% of them. Autism, which 33% of the kids who are seeking to transition are on the autistic spectrum. Poor peer relationships, sexual abuse, attachment disorder, unresolved grief or loss, same-sex attraction, and excessive time online. We know these are kids who are struggling. These are kids who are at risk for a lot of things. They're struggling and they're vulnerable and they get sucked into this, okay? We can see that they're kids who have had adverse childhood experiences, whether it's family conflict, death, bullying, sexual abuse, financial stress, frequent moves, all kinds of things. These are kids who have really struggled, and they continue to struggle, but once they're diagnosed with this, and then this is more the same, 88%, once they're diagnosed with anything, any kind of gender dysphoria, it overshadows and takes over. So that the remedy becomes, marshaling this child, shepherding this child through a transition, rather than attempting to treat the underlying issue. If we listen to people who have gone through this, a transition, and then have, you know, as they mature, they sort of come to their senses, they realize it's not working, that they aren't really trans, they're not going to be the opposite sex, and they're out there, they're very vocal. They tend to be bullied online when they speak up, but they still speak up anyway. Some of them are the ones who have been testifying in front of the legislators. Chloe Cole, for example, is a young woman who had a double mastectomy at 15, and 2 months later was sitting in her health class and listening to the teacher talk about the importance of the mother-child bonding process, and as she sat there, she realized she would never be able to breastfeed her baby. No one went through that with her. If they did, she didn't, like, you can't appreciate that as a 15-year-old. It's hard to appreciate how important that was. Unbelievable. So, comments from the detransitioners. Transitioning for me was a massive F you to the hurt child inside of me. It was me telling her that she didn't matter, that I hated her and wanted to erase her existence. It was war against myself. Here's another one, a detransitioned female. I hate so much that I've destroyed my body with experimental hormones and surgeries. I will forever have to replace the silicone in my chest to achieve the appearance of breasts. I will never be able to breastfeed my future children, and I don't even know if I can have children. This is a young woman who detransitioned, I think she's 19, coming to this realization. What are we doing? We are so out of step with the consensus of the international community. This must be the only issue on which we seem like we're constantly looking to the international community to try to see what we should do. But in this issue, we are going it alone. Sweden, Finland, France, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK have all walked back, going all in on gender-affirming care, restricting the use of hormones and puberty blockers and prioritizing instead the use of psychotherapy. They're urging caution with respect to medical interventions, but instead what we're doing is we're pushing earlier medical intervention and pushing this ideology into every aspect of our schools. The NHS, the UK's health system, just in the last month ended the gender affirmative care model for youth in England and closed the Tavistock Clinic, which was the largest clinic for gender affirming care in the world, and deemed that it was unsafe for children. So what are we doing? We need to come to our senses. Here's a physician from Chicago, from Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago. There's not a full range of evidence to support the treatments that we're using, but there is a lot of anecdotal evidence. Gee, thanks. Sometimes parents will say, I want to make sure my child is really trans. I turn to the child, what gender identity do you have? There's no form, there's no scale, no psychological battery of tests that needs to be done. I just ask the child. It's so easy. There's a doctor from Vanderbilt describing how she was able to persuade Vanderbilt University Children's Hospital to go all in on gender-affirming care when she informed the hospital that it was a big money maker. And she mentioned to them, she said, well, you make a lot of money just from double mastectomies, but it's the bottom surgeries that are really lucrative, and the child is going to be on hormones for life. So we're going to make a lot of money. And they went all in on this. All right. It's important to keep in mind that medical experts can be horribly wrong. And you can look at incidents like the the fad of lobotomies to treat mental health issues. Did you know the inventor of the lobotomy won the Nobel Prize? And 20 years later was banished in disgrace. Okay? That was an absolute fad. The claim was that it improved mental disorders, anxiety, depression, a lot of the things we're trying to improve with these kids. But the reality was you brain damaged these children. Okay? Thalidomide, a drug that was used off-label, quote unquote, to prevent morning sickness. What was the result? It caused children to be born with missing limbs, okay? Based on that off-label use. Opioid use. The opioid epidemic we're dealing with it now because the claim was that it was necessary to control pain and that it was not addictive. It's reversible, no problem, right? It's not addictive, but what's the reality? The reality is we're dealing with millions of people whose lives have been destroyed by these medications, which is not, I have physicians in my family. I'm not, I love our doctors, right? But doctors can be wrong. And this is one instance where this model they're embracing is radically, radically wrong. Okay. What does this do to the family? Well, we have lawsuits all over the country. Here's an article about it with Virginia, but there are lawsuits in Wisconsin and California and in Florida where parents are suing school districts for hiding, promoting a gender transition and hiding it from the parents. Here in the New Hanover School District in North Carolina, there was a controversy recently because at a school board meeting, the Title IX director unveiled the new gender support plan. And in the gender support plan, there is a section where they ask about whether or not the parents or guardians should be involved. And they will only be involved if they are deemed to be highly supportive. And otherwise, the school district will not tell them. And the members of the school board asked the Title IX director, and he said, well, it's a case-by-case scenario. I mean, we'll involve the parents of young kids. Oh, yeah, it's a case-by-case scenario. But once they're teenagers, we got to balance FERPA and the rights of parents with the right of the child to privacy. He's not going to tell the parents. Are you kidding me? Okay? We have glitter families, which is the larger LGBT community, telling our kids it's okay to walk away from unsupportive parents. We are your glitter family. We are here for you. They groom them online to leave their families. And that's what families who are going through this with their kids, that's what they're contending with. And these glitter moms can be even people at church, people who are like, oh, I'll support you. It doesn't have to be the creepy people online. It's people who come up and say, I'm sorry your parents aren't supportive. I'll support you. And they refer to the child by desired name and pronouns. We see family relationships being subverted through language, right? Here's a mother and a son who became a dad and a daughter. What does that do to the rest of the family? In real life, how does it undermine reason and the ability to know the truth? Well, here's a 51-year-old transgender woman, girl Alex. Okay, come on. You give this picture to a kid, what are they going to see? They're going to see a man who's wearing a dress. He's not even trying to look feminine, right? But somehow we're all supposed to affirm him and say, oh, you're a girl, right? Not even spelling it correctly, okay? It's subverting reason, teaching children to distrust their senses, teaching them there's no such thing as human nature, that there's no truth, and that feelings are the ultimate arbiter of reality. All around us, our kids are seeing health authorities, news media accounts, all of these sources going all in on this. Here's Healthline. Can men get pregnant? Yes, it's possible for men to become pregnant and give birth. Are you kidding me? You have just compromised the integrity. Newsweek, why a woman, I'm not even going to say it, you know? I mean, the BBC edited a rape victim's quotes about her transgender attacker to get the pronouns right, because she referred to him as a he, and they changed the pronouns from her testimony. All over. We see in women's sports, right? Like the NCAA gave, University of Pennsylvania nominated Leah, formerly Will Thomas, as for Woman of the Year. What an insult to the women on that team. And the message to young girls is you don't matter. You're a menstruator, you're a body with female parts, but that does not make you a woman. And this man who says he's a woman, he's a woman. And he's the one we're going to protect. There's a bunch of high school girls. I wanted to weep as I watched an interview with a 14-year-old girl who was asked by her school to write a letter of apology when she called out a student, a 14-year-old student, who identified as transgender, wanted to join the women's volleyball team, and stood in the locker room and watched her change. And when she objected to it, the school district told her she had to join the restorative justice circle and write a letter of apology. So what's the effect? Well, this is the vulnerable age group. The age group that is most likely to identify as trans or non-binary is this youngest age group. We don't even have the statistics for kids, although the survey from the Pittsburgh Public Schools was that it was easily 10%, so it would be much higher than this. But this generation is being affected by this. Why? Because they are being force-fed this new anthropology with its radical claims about what it means to be a human being, right? And it has worrying effects for us with respect to our faith. And I'm going to give you some hope here, okay? These are 2021 figures showing that Catholics, as well as other Christians, but Catholics seem to be pretty susceptible. Why? I think because as Catholics, we kind of pride ourselves on being, you know, people who are not at odds with science. So science tells us that men can become women, and as Catholics, we say, well, the Catholic Church teaches that you can know things through science, so all right, it must be the case, right? So here are statistics from 2021, and the upshot was that of Catholics, 45% of all Catholics and 56% of Hispanic Catholics believed that a person's identity as man or woman could be different from the person's sex. And the numbers get higher as you go into unaffiliated or young adults. That's really worrying, because if you think back to how much at odds this is with Christian anthropology, we can't catechize. If our young people buy into this vision of the person, they cannot understand their faith. And nor will they want to, because we see the number one reason for disaffiliation among young people very often is citing LGBT issues. They don't understand what the church teaches because they don't, on this issue, because they don't understand what the church teaches about what it means to be a human person. And so you can see, if you look at all of the issues that are affected or undermined by gender ideology, if you take out that vision of the person, you're going to undermine everything, including the incarnation and Christology. Because how do we understand Jesus Christ, true God and true man, incarnate as a man, if you believe that masculinity is something that that can be altered at will and that the body has no intrinsic meaning? How do you even understand that? How do you understand moral theology with this, which believes that our actions have to do, they affect your soul? Why? Because of this intimate unity of body and soul. So what you do with your body matters very much. How do we even teach on marriage, on human sexuality, on reproductive issues? How do we defend religious liberty? How do we defend conscience rights? So what are we to do? Well, we have to speak the truth. This is a quote from Pope Francis: "Don't play with truths. Let us call things by their name." Pope St. Paul VI: "It is an outstanding manifestation of charity towards souls to omit nothing from the saving doctrine of Christ." So what does the church teach? Well, the church actually has very clear guidance. Do not listen to the celebrity priests or celebrity religious or celebrity Catholics writing online about the Catholic Church's stance towards people who are trans and how we have to affirm and build bridges, etc., etc. Because it is utterly at odds with everything our Holy Fathers have taught and with the teaching of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Pope Francis, in Amoris Laetitia, in Laudato Si', spoke directly on point about gender ideology. And he lamented the fact that it denies sexual difference, it destroys the link between biological sex and how we understand ourselves, and seeks to cancel out sexual difference, which will eliminate the basis of the family. Pope Benedict, in his address in 2012, his Christmas address to the Curia, noted that Denying the preordained duality of man and woman denies the family as a reality established by creation. And he states, when the freedom to be creative becomes the freedom to create yourself, then you are denying the Creator. You are denying God himself. The Congregation for Catholic Education stated, gender ideology promotes a personal identity and emotional intimacy radically separated from the biological difference between male and female. And consequently, human identity becomes the choice of the individual, one which can also change over time. And it lamented the fact that you get this liquidity, this liquid utopia like of the neuter, where there's no meaning in life. It's essentially you're descending into nihilism. And as a reminder, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, everyone should acknowledge and accept your sexual identity. Laudato Si spoke at length about human ecology, about how accepting your bodies as God's gift is vital for any kind of authentic environmentalism. And that if you want to be able to meet people and encounter people and have authentic relationships, you have to learn to value your own body in its femininity or its masculinity, because otherwise you can't recognize and relate to people. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, in a letter to a bishop in Spain, when asked about whether or not a person who identified as transgender could serve as a godparent, wrote back and said, no. Why? Because this person, in this person's living, the way they're living their life, illustrated that they have not yet resolved the problem of sexual identity according to the truth of sex itself. And the Catechism of the Catholic Church, except when performed for strictly therapeutic medical reasons, directly intended amputations, mutilations, and sterilizations performed on innocent persons are against the moral law. We have clear teaching. We cannot support this. Our Ukrainian bishops warned about the totalitarian nature of this movement and said this is something that's being aggressively imposed in every single area of our life. Pope Benedict XVI, again, says this is going to be something that's harmful to human dignity. Why? Because when you remove that relationship to God the Creator, when you deny God as your Creator, you are stripping yourself of your dignity. And ultimately, it comes back and harms all of society. Who are you? You are a son or daughter of God. Why are you given freedom? You're given freedom to pursue the good. You are not given freedom from God or from nature. Okay. All right. So the bottom line, why does the church oppose this? It's not true. It's opposed to sacred scripture, the teaching of Genesis. It's opposed to human dignity. It's opposed to Christian anthropology. It treats the body instrumentally as something that's discardable and just as something that merely exists for personal expression. It undermines religious liberty, free speech. It redefines relationships in the family. Most important, I think, for persuading people is that it leads to physical and mental and moral harm, and therefore is neither compassionate nor loving. Okay? Now, I mentioned there was some hope, right? So if you remember back to that chart I showed you right here, where we had kind of the dreadful image of how Catholics have been confused about sex and identity, the latest poll from the Pew Research Center on attitudes towards this issue has noted that among Catholics, the share who say a person's gender identity or gender cannot differ from sex at birth has risen from 52% to 62%. So up 10 points in a year. It still is too low, but we're headed in the right direction. Why are we headed in the right direction? Because of the courageous witness of bishops like your bishop who invited me into this diocese to speak. That is why. And because of the many bishops around the country who have been writing pastoral letters and setting policies in place and creating schools and religious education programs where children are taught to appreciate their God-given sex as a source of their dignity and as important for relationships. So what can you do? Well, it's easy to remember things if you keep it literal, And so the first thing I would emphasize is that it's important to follow these 3 points. Be proactive be protective of these children, and be personal in your approach to each child, okay? What would that look like? Well, first of all, you have to set the stage by pointing out that the person is suffering, right? And we know from sacred scripture that every time Jesus encountered a person who was suffering, he looked at him with love, right? We know that. These are families and children who are confused and hurting. They're trying to heal. They're trying to heal their relationships. They're trying to keep their kids. They're trying to keep custody of their kids, right? And so they need our support. They don't need our support in affirming their child, but they need our support when they are trying to keep their child on track and trying to oppose this. And they need to know, even if they go down the wrong path, that the church is always here to welcome them back and walk with them as long as they are walking towards Jesus, okay? We need to be aware that social contagion is a very real part of this phenomenon. And so any pastoral decisions, if you're a teacher, if you're working with kids at all, you have to keep in mind not only trying to accompany that child, but that there is real potential for scandal and social contagion among other children. And that's why you cannot tolerate this in a school program or in a religious education program. Affirmation is something that any charity that is oriented towards God and towards the truth will lead you to see that affirmation is something that not only undermines catechesis, but actually causes harm to the person. And so you cannot separate truth from love. They're inseparable. If you love someone, you will want that person to go towards the truth. You will offer real support and you will offer hope. So what can you do as a parent? Well, as a parent, it's important to sort of lay the foundation and build that relationship. Remember I talked about these glitter families. It functions like a cult. It really does. Where they're trying cults work by peeling children away from their families. So you as a parent, you need to inoculate your child through talking with your kids as they get older, as soon as you see first signs, and believe me, it's earlier than you think, lay the foundation. Worship together, do things together, do fun things together, build that relationship with your child. Take your child out in nature. Ask open-ended questions to get your child talking. Preventative, assess the influence of friends, of social media, of what's going on in school. You've always got to be watchful, and as soon as you see something that's harmful, you'd better be in there addressing it, okay? And personal, set boundaries, but affirm the person. Love that child. Let that child know that you love him or her enough to die for them. This is a great resource. I'm not going to go through this right now because I want to leave some time for questions. But this is a book by a woman named Marie Keffler who had a daughter who went through this. And so she started Advocates Protecting Children, and I think is involved in Partners for Ethical Care, which is another online group. They're both very good. They're not Catholic, but they're very good, and these are started by many Catholics and some very good Christian women. But she's gone through and she has this amazing analysis of the parallels between gender identity and other potential cults, where they spot the vulnerable kids, they draw them in, they love bomb them, they tell them their families don't understand them, they separate them, they have an orthodoxy that they require these kids to conform with, and they permit zero tolerance of criticism, right? There's no tolerance of criticism. So it functions like a cult. And if you as a parent realize that, you're going to get your guard up, because this is not something that you can just sort of go along with or treat as a phase. This is serious, okay? So personal, proactive, I think I talked about all of these, so I'll go through these. A big thing is getting your child into nature, getting them involved in service to other people, and disconnecting them from social media so that these kids have healthy relationships. Personal accompaniment, I really want to emphasize this point from Pope Francis. Although it sounds obvious, spiritual accompaniment must lead others ever closer to God, okay? Some people think they're free if they can avoid God. They fail to see that they remain existentially orphaned, helpless, or homeless. To accompany them would be counterproductive if it became a sort of therapy supporting their self-absorption and ceased to be a pilgrimage with Christ to the Father. Now again, there's so much about Pope Francis's writings that is underreported, and statements like this are never reported, right? Because it doesn't fit the narrative that our secular media wants to portray about Pope Francis, where he's just the loving, benevolent uncle who affirms you no matter what you do. No. He understands this is a destructive phenomenon, and his understanding of accompaniment is that it is walking alongside someone toward Jesus. It's not true accompaniment if you're accompanying them to the gates of hell, or to self-mutilation, or to your local gender clinic, okay? In conversations with young people who are struggling, big thing is to listen, get them talking, ask open-ended questions. What do you mean? How do you feel? Tell me about this. I'd like to understand. But at the same time, you have to affirm the truth. Sex cannot change. You're male or female. You don't have to feel bound by destructive stereotypes. We'll help you get through this. I'm always here for you, but I can't support something that I know is harmful. And the big thing that our kids need to hear over and over again is God loves you and he has a plan for your life. Speak the truth with love, affirming the person, not the identity. And the final point I want to make is the messages we need to give to our kids are the following. We need to let them know they are a unity of body and soul made to live in relationship with others, and that these relationships are given to them and are what make us human. They're integral and important to us as human beings. And this is what it means to be part of God's magnificent creation. As part of that, your body is a gift. Your body has meaning. Sexual identity is a gift. Being male or female is a horizon, not a confining box. If you're wounded, your wounds can be healed. And again, we need to be giving our young people hope. They need to hear this message of hope. They need to hear us with conviction, conveying to them that God has a wonderful and amazing plan for their life. The truth is, you are wonderfully made. Male and female, your body, your identity is God's gift to you. Thank you. I have some resources. I'm part of this group, the Person and Identity Project, which was started so that we could give resources to dioceses and to parents in schools around the country. It's a Catholic organization. You can access it online. I don't know if you'll be able to do this with this screen, but you can use your phone to go online, or you can go on to personandidentity.com. But there are resources out there. I know it seems like we don't have resources, but I mentioned Advocates Protecting Children. I mentioned the book by Maria Keffler, Desist, Detrans, and Detox. There's a secular organization called SEGM, which is the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. Our Person and Identity website has all kinds of resources and has links to all of these resources I mentioned here. And finally, if you know someone who's struggling with this, the local Encourage chapter. So Courage is the organization that exists to reach out to persons who are struggling with same-sex attraction, but the Encourage groups are for their family members. And that has become the de facto landing place for families that are dealing with this. It isn't what the organization was founded to do, but in some places, some of these Encourage chapters are almost all families of kids struggling with identifying as transgender. So if you know someone who is Catholic and who is struggling with this, really encourage them to reach out to Encourage, pun intended, because it's very important for them not to walk alone. I sat one day in a mother's kitchen. She was a beautiful woman with a beautiful daughter, living in a gorgeous house. The rest of this family had it all. Involved with their church, The kids were very smart, involved in activities, right? But her daughter got sucked into first the Gay Straight Alliance at school, and then went off to college, and was sucked in. Within a semester, came home and told the family, I'm trans and you need to support me. And it just devastated the whole family, right? But the thing that I will never forget is that this mother said to me, I don't feel like I can go back. I'm so ashamed. And she was blaming herself. She shouldn't be blaming herself. It's a cult. Kids get pulled into cults, right? But as I sat there and listened, I thought, we are failing these families. These families, and she was upset too because some of the families in her Catholic church were affirming her daughter. We are failing these families. We need to let them know they are loved. We love them. We love their children. We understand. We're not here to blame them. We're here to support them. We want their children to thrive. We want their children to be healed. And we're here for them. And that's our job, our commitment. If you take nothing else away from this lecture, I ask you to take that away, because that broke my heart. Anyway, thank you very much. I can take some questions if you'd like. You guys have been great. It's so late on a Saturday. My goodness, it's such a depressing topic. Do you have a microphone, Paul? Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Well, you actually need to get rid of those people, but no, you know what? I think the model should be the parents in Loudoun County, Virginia, who really have been, now, I mean, politics aside, whatever you think of Glenn Youngkin was elected because he listened to parents and he understood that these parents are very concerned that children were being transitioned behind the back and that boys were being allowed to use the girls' bathroom. If you remember, there was publicly a child who was raped, and then they moved the offender, and then he raped another girl, right, in the bathroom at school, all the while denying it, right? So if you look to what their strategy was, here is what they did. They unmasked what was going on. And the first thing, I was looking around at the Charlotte-Mecklenburg website. Their gender support plan is hidden. It needs to be out in the open. It needs to be online so parents can see that they have a plan to transition children without the parents' consent, because I guarantee you they have it. I guarantee you it was evident from some of the articles I found on alternative media, but it's hidden, it's buried on their website. So we need transparency, and parents first and foremost need to see what's going on in these schools. The second thing is people need to go into the libraries and look at these resources. And again, if you look at what the parents in Loudoun County, Virginia did, they went to their school board meetings and started reading excerpts from the books that were in the grade school and middle school. Yes, and that has to be done. And I will tell you this, those parents, even before this happened, the Diocese of Arlington was so supportive to those parents. They were doing educational programs like this in all of their parishes for 2 years running up to it. They were supporting these parents as they were trying to work to reform the public schools. So the diocese played a role, not directly, but indirectly in terms of saying, hey, this is what's going on, and you have rights as a parent, because parents are the primary educators of their children. So if you start with those two steps, first and foremost, those are really, 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 really important. Then from there, then you can look to see what referrals are taking place. Do they have cooperative programs with some of these organizations in Charlotte that deal with transitioning children, right? And if you start with just those steps, I think you'll be amazed. I think you will be amazed. Most families don't know what's going on. They do not know what's going on, and we need to shine some sunlight. Mm-hmm.
About three questions. One is, you said that the United States is going on with this blindly, despite the fact that the rest of the world's rejecting it. And I'm wondering about, does that have to do with that Anthony Kennedy thing with the Supreme Court? Is that why? And also, don't the lawsuits and things start to scare these people? And what's the long-term prognosis on this in our country? Is it going to be, people going to come to recognize the message sooner or later?
Sooner or later. It's unavoidable. It took 20 years before we got rid of lobotomies. If you look at the history of lobotomies, 20 years. In fact, the doctor who pioneered that used to go around with a mobile lobotomobile, and he would go around and do lobotomies at different points around, like drive around from city to city, which is horrifying, right? So it took 20 years. The problem we have is that it's extremely difficult to win a medical malpractice lawsuit, right? And as it is right now, because it takes about 7 years before a young person realizes that he or she has made a mistake and hasn't given informed consent, they're outside of the statute of limitations. So the first thing to do from a legal strategy is to extend the statute of limitations for anyone who's gone through gender-affirming care, quote unquote, so that gives them a longer window so that they can come back and sue for harm. That is, I think, the first thing that has to be done, because in this country we are a for-profit medical system which has enormous benefits. I have a daughter with Down syndrome who's benefited from all the advances in medicine, and I have a daughter with Crohn's who has benefited from all the pharmaceutical research, right? But on the other hand, money is a very powerful incentive, and as we saw from the clip from Vanderbilt University, money can cause people to sign on to something and then persuade themselves they're doing something. So.
And also the socialists and the communists are pushing this agenda in order to cause dysphoria in children.
Yeah, I think, if I were giving a philosophy lecture, I would go back to cultural Marxism, which was brought here from Germany in the 1920s, late 1920s, 1930s, before the Second World War, because it was a group of philosophers who were fleeing Nazism, and they settled at Columbia University and taught at the teaching college, right? And started working with John Dewey to push all of these ideas in. But I will say, I think, we could have an esoteric discussion about that, but I gotta say, I think the biggest issue is that years ago, in 1968, with the advent of the sexual revolution, Catholics as well as other denominations accepted the underlying premises of the sexual revolution, which was that sex can be divorced from procreation and from God's design for the human person. And from there, you can trace first no-fault divorce, contraception, abortion, no-fault divorce, same-sex marriage, and once you deny that sexual difference is important for marriage, then why have sexual difference at all? So in a larger sense, while we can look at philosophers and look at other groups, any of us, anyone who has gone along with the underlying premises of the sexual revolution is part of this. We bear some responsibility for it.
So then where have you seen best practices of Catholic schools, if this is all just a continuation of sexual revolution, right? This is next. Where have you seen best practices of Catholic schools or Catholic dioceses leveraging Catholic education to teach authentic sexuality and identity, which is the antidote, right? It's the upstream antidote to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Affirming who's doing it well in terms of Catholic schools and dioceses of using their educational system to teach.
Yeah, I actually, you know what? I am a huge fan of Catholic education, not only to protect children from things like this, but also because I think education should never be, if you read Cardinal Newman, his idea of the university, all of education should be ordered around the truth that God is the creator and has created all things, and so everything is evidence of his involvement and his providential care. So I would be a huge proponent of Catholic education anyway. But what we've seen in the wake of the pandemic and with all of the wokeness being pushed into schools is that parents are looking for a refuge to preserve their children's innocence, and the Catholic schools are it, because we're a school system, a system of schools that understands that that child is a unity of body and soul, and so we're going to shield the child, protect the child's innocence, keep this child on track, ordered towards maturing as a young man or a young woman, growing in virtue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, in terms of best practices then, it's extremely important for dioceses to have clear, stated policies. Like, we are Catholic. We believe that you are created male or female from the moment of conception and that you cannot change your sex. And therefore, at our school, girls use the girls' bathroom and boys use the boys' bathroom. We compete on teams accordingly, and we will regard and treat your child with the dignity that he or she deserves as a child of God, but in accordance with his or her biological sex. Policy like that, stated simply, clear uniform guidelines, consistent application, and you will have a very sheltered place where at least there, no matter what the child encounters outside of the school, there's a reality check when they show up at school. So I actually think one of the keys for us, and this is something to work on with these school boards, is that, and with, as a sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, a political goal, although I would argue that this is the ultimate social justice issue, is school choice. Because if you are going to be essentially teaching what is a cult-like, quasi-religious view of the person, I should be able to take my tax dollars and go somewhere else so that my children can be taught the religion that I want them to learn, not the religion that you think they should learn, right? And that's a matter of social justice. And we've seen even with the pandemic, with all the issues with education being denied to children in poor neighborhoods, that school choice really is a matter of educational justice.
In terms of charter schools, what are your thoughts? Are they going down the path of the public way, or do you see them veering off in a different direction?
Yeah, unfortunately, charter schools, which offered so much promise, are part of the public school system. So we've seen in places like Minnesota, lawsuits brought against charter schools to force them to conform to gender ideology. In fact, there was a classical school in Minnesota that was written about by, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the woman who wrote about it, but the long and the short of it was that the family that sued the charter school is the same family that founded the gender organization Gender Spectrum, and they forced that school to comply. And even though the child was no longer enrolled there, they insisted as a condition of the settlement that the charter school had to conduct gender identity diversity trainings with staff, parents, and students because they are a public school. So because of that tight linkage to the public school, unfortunately, charter schools are going to be subject to the same regulations. And they shouldn't be, right? But here we are. So it's going to take, it is going to take rewriting the guidelines governing charter schools at the state level for the charter schools to be able to be free of this. And that's the problem.
Okay, my second question is, my son is, well, at the time he was 5, he's 6 now, but he was in a camp with a child who kept saying to him, boys can marry boys and girls can marry girls. And he came home and he said, Mommy, is that true? And I literally had to take like a day or so to think about that. And my dad, who's sitting right here, was like, you need to speak on this like right now. And I had to have like an hour conversation with him before bed and just say, like, we don't follow that. You know, there are people that go down different paths, and that is not our path. And we have a mommy and a daddy, and you have your brother, and I didn't go anywhere near trans issues because it wasn't brought up, and I really didn't know how to approach it, and I didn't even want to bring it up. But I pulled him from the camp because I just didn't want him around that child who was a few grades older than him, that for some reason they just kept getting put together. Was that a correct way of saying it? I don't want him to be hateful to people, but I also don't want him to accept this either as an option.
Yeah, and you could even, especially with the trans issue, I would be even stronger, which is not just to say this is what we believe, but that this is categorically impossible. But you can say there are a lot of people who are confused, and we have to be very kind to them when they're confused about this. And it's really important for us, because we know the truth, to show them how much we love and care for other people. And that's the way I think, and now you're forewarned, right? Like, because it is shocking when your little child who's so innocent comes to you with these questions. I get it. It's one of those things. I can remember having similar experiences where you're like, where you have to even find out where the question came from, because you can't answer the question till you know where it came from. But you have to be prepared, and believe me, the question is going to come sooner than you think, because it's being pushed into all the children's programming. Blue's Clues, the episode with the Pride Parade, and a drag queen on it was just shocking. Just shocking. We can't even have kids just having childhood. So now you're ready, right? And you can say, no, there are a lot of people who are very confused, but you know and I know, and then you can talk about the wonderful human body and genetically the differences and say, but there are a lot of people who are confused today, and so we have to be kind. And that I think is how I would handle that.
Why don't we protect our children by pushing our lawmakers to establish age limit for transgender operation? We would not let 10 years old or 14 years old to manage our finances. Parents would not let them to manage their finances. Parents would not let them drive a car, but they let them to make a life-changing decision. We need to press our lawmakers, and we need to ask the people who run for political offices, what are you going to do about age limit for transgender operations?
Well, so it's actually a little more complicated than that. You're absolutely right. But what we're facing here is the next step in what's referred to legally as the mature minor doctrine. The mature minor doctrine has been in place since the advent of school clinics in the 1980s and 1990s, when the first school clinics, school-based healthcare centers went in New York City, where they were distributing contraceptives. And the justification for that was that a child is not mature in any area except in terms of reproductive decisions and human sexuality. And so the justification that is being used for this is that doctrine, that when it comes to a child's sex, and now because the Biden administration, with their ruling or their proposed language on Title IX, wants to redefine sex as including gender identity, Title IX and the mature minor doctrine are going to be extended to gender identity and have been treated like that in the courts. So if you go to your provider and you say, or you go to someone who's doing these transgender surgeries, they're going to say, are you kidding? Your child is entitled to privacy and decisions as soon as he or she turns 11. If you have a child who is 11 or 12 years old and you have one of those portals from the insurance company, try to find their healthcare history. Because we do our healthcare through UPMC. Pittsburgh is probably about as socially conservative as you can get for a blue city or a like kind of purple state, you know. It's like the blue collar, old blue dog Democrats. And as soon as my kids turn 11 or 12, I can't access their records. I can access their immunizations. I can't access anything else. I am not allowed to go onto their portal unless I set up myself with using subterfuge as he or she, as them. And it's an incredibly complicated process to get their medical records. And so that's their justification for doing this. So it's a bigger problem than this, because this is what's being used to put IUDs in children, to give them access to contraceptives, to give them access to abortions, et cetera, et cetera. right? So this is just the latest front on that. But all of it is destroying and eroding the rights of parents to guide their children. And it makes no sense. You're right. You know, I just went through the process of helping my 16-year-old son get his driver's license. And like, my goodness, I had to sign so many documents. I had to certify, swear before like a notary that I had driven with him for 65 hours, this, that, and the other thing, all for getting a driver's license. And here's the problem. Yeah, but we have hope. Our Lady has assured us, Our Lady of Fatima told the visionary Lucia that the battle has already been won. And if you keep that in mind, right? Like our Lord triumphs, there will be a period of peace, but right now we're in the fight. So we've got to show up. We have to show up, because if not us, then who? Right? And that's the thing. But we know we win. We win in the end. It might not be pretty, but we do win.
What's the talk for tomorrow with the kids gonna look like? Because I'm horrified.
It's gonna be very similar, but a little bit more ordered towards, you know, trying to talk directly to them about things like this. But I have to tell you, and I think it's important for kids to come and hear this with their parents. But I've had families bring their kids to these talks. I'm taking out some of the graphic images because they don't need to see that. But on the other hand, I've found that teenagers kind of appreciate straight talk, and they need to hear this. So if you're worried at all, or you think it's too much for your kids, don't bring them, talk to them yourself. But if you think your kid would benefit from sort of a slap on the face, bring them in. But I mean, they're seeing this at school. That's the thing. Like, they're immersed in this. So you almost have to be, you can't speak in euphemisms. You have to be very direct and say, here are the results. This is how it harms this child's body.
And to support that point, they're seeing it online.
Yes.
They're being taught. That is where the majority of, sadly, our adolescents are spending their social opportunities are online.
Yes.
And they need to see the hardcore reality.
Yes.
that children are being mutilated and they're being brainwashed in this direction.
Mm-hmm.
It's at the end of the day, it's their fight, and that's really frightening. Yes. So we need to arm our children with the truth and the reality and prayer.
Yeah. I remember a number of years ago, now again, I'm from Pittsburgh, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette did a big spread on a child who had transitioned at Bethel Park High School. And this child was a young woman who was on the swim team. So on the cover of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, they showed this young woman, topless, getting out of the pool with mastectomy scars on full view. I was horrified by it, but then I realized she's going into the boys' locker room. And everyone in the school who comes to a swim meet is seeing this young woman topless with those mastectomy scars. That, if your kids are in a public school, that's what they're seeing. That is what they're seeing. They do. We all do. You're right. I mean, they showed Ellen Page, you know, that poor actress, and showed her with her mastectomy scars, and we're all supposed to be like, oh, look, this is wonderful. It worked out so well. Honestly, it's on the covers. It's everywhere. So yeah, it is. We're in for a fight, but we have to. But I actually have a lot of confidence in this generation. They just need to hear the truth. They've been through a lot. Everything they've been through with COVID has been absolutely brutal. They're struggling, but they need to know. At the end of the day, kids need to know that you're being honest with them. Right? And if you can give them kind of an honest presentation of the facts. And I thought about pulling my punches today, and I was at the catechetical conference, and some young woman came up to me afterwards. It was actually more raw than this one. And she came up to me and she said, kids need to see this. And I was like, I guess I needed to hear that. Because my own instinct is to try to protect them. But they need to be with their parents. I don't want to talk to any, kids need to come with their parents to hear this.
It seems to me, that, at least at some levels in some areas, like Hollywood and like now with Leah Thomas and like pro and college sport, there's some level where it's like in vogue, right, to like be gender non-conforming, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, because of that, so much of pop culture is inundated with this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
How do you suggest we, and by we I mean like adults, approach that in a way where we don't like shield our kids from the world? Because at the end of the day, they're gonna see the Marvel movie, they're gonna see they're gonna listen to the new album, they're gonna, you get what I'm saying, like there's gonna be access.
Yeah.
How do we approach that in a way that affirms our beliefs, but without like forcing ourselves to become like a closed community to the world? Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm wording that well.
Yeah, I think you have to come armed with facts, right? It can't just be, well, first of all, you've got to be able to contextualize in a compassionate way. So if a kid tells you about someone who identifies as trans, that's already a kid who's struggling, and your kid, when your child talks to you, your child is aware of that, right? So the reaction should be, oh my goodness, that poor child, those are really harmful treatments, and that's a child who's very confused and struggling, and I feel so badly because this is not going to solve his or her problems, right? Your child already knows that this child has underlying issues. And then you can say, well, they're doing all this to this child's body, but the real issue is this internal issue, right? They know, kids know. Every time I've talked to my kids about someone who's been struggling at school, they're more aware of it than we are. But you've got to be able to say, to sort of reorient them. They bring this to you because they want you to reorient them. They're questioning, they're asking you, they're mentioning it to you because they need to hear you say, oh my goodness, that poor child, that is going to be really harmful for his or her body, and it's not going to solve his or her problems, and I feel very badly that this child is going through that. So your response has to be one where you're not judging, you're very compassionate, but you're also very clear that there is medical harm going on here. And if you do that, that's the first step of the conversation. Because the one thing that this generation does not want to hear is someone dropping judgment on someone else. They're very kind. They tend to be very loyal. They're loyal to their parents. They're loyal to their friends. They have been taught that judgment is a bad thing. And so anytime you criticize or critique the behavior, it's got to be coming at it armed with, objective fact, but in a way where you're expressing compassion for the person. And that's based on my interaction with this, with all these kids in this generation. That is what you have to do that, or they'll tune you out.
Tonight you covered a lot of good things. A lot. I can't remember them all. You got a lot of sources up there. I can't necessarily read them all. It's not necessarily my thing, but do you have one source you would recommend that kind of highlights a lot of your data, logic, and narrative that I could take back and learn just that one source to start with?
There is, okay, so at what level? Like,
well, I want your PowerPoint, like, to be honest, I want your slides. I know you said you wouldn't send them out. I got to go through Paul to get them.
Oh, yeah,
but
yeah,
I love the data. I love the examples. I'm going into Thanksgiving. My mom doesn't think this is a big deal, but I know that it is.
Okay.
And I'm trying to use that, but.
So
yeah.
If you want data, if you're a data-driven person, you want to be able to say, to bring facts to someone, you need to go to the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, which is an organization started by a group of physicians. One of them is a doctor who's an endocrinologist named Will Malone. He's a young guy. He's got a bunch of kids. He's actually Catholic. But his approach, because we've talked to him, his approach is he's doing everything from the secular side because he's trying to keep medicine on track, right? So they have all of the latest studies demonstrating the harm of all of these issues, okay? So that's a great resource for data. That would be the first thing. If you go to our website, person and identity, hold on, let me go back to this. We have a whole section on medical resources, okay? So go to that website, pull up, we have all kinds of studies, we have articles written by people. This is another great book. They were selling this at the conference. It's called Sexual Identity. It's written by a group of physicians. And in it, there are two doctors in particular. So one, there's a psychologist who wrote a chapter. There's a doctor who's an endocrinologist, Paul Hrues, who is on faculty out at St. Louis University. And he has an article just sort of talking about sexual identity and biological development. But there's a chapter in there by a surgeon named Patrick Lappert. And he is a plastic surgeon. And in his chapter here in this book, he walks through what happens with one of these gender-affirming surgeries, as well as puberty blockers and hormones. And it's extremely well written. But he's coming at it, again, from the perspective of medicine, saying this doesn't heal the body, right? So those are the resources I would recommend. And if you have someone who thinks it's not a big deal, you have got to start with medical harm, because that's our touch point with the secular culture. The coalition of people who has come together to fight this is a coalition of people that includes radical feminists, some of them in the UK, a lot of them in the United States. It includes atheists. It includes all kinds of, all kinds of groups that have just been sort of brought together in order to work together on this coalition. Every now and then you'll see a fracturing of the coalition. You mention the word abortion and you'll see like 30 people peel out of the group and be like, blah, 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 Roe v. Wade, right? But then they always come back because we need to be working together. So it's a coalition based on reason, based on the concept that there is real medical harm that is occurring, and that this is a view of the person that is not supported by reason or by science.
Thank you. And one last unsolicited piece of advice. If you could put that in one of those Knights of Columbus books that are really thin that I can read on a Sunday afternoon, you would reach so many people with that.
In my spare time, right? As I'm driving.
Hopefully this week I'll be able to get those resources up on our website too, so that at least the big ones, so that you can go to them.
And that book by Maria Keffler that I mentioned is amazing. It is amazing. It's easy to read, but the analysis of gender ideology as a cult is like, you read it and your eyes are open. And in fact, I know I know people who are involved in this fight against gender ideology who are not coming from a perspective of religion, but they've been in cults. And so they're in for the fight because they recognize a cult when they see one.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you so much for all this information. And I'm a Catholic mental health therapist in the area. And I know we have many, many people, of course, teens, preteens, young adults, and parents of these individuals that are affected. And I'm surprised so much at the turnout tonight, because I know just from our experience how many people's lives have been touched by this and are currently touched by this. So I guess my question to you is, what have you seen in the communities in terms of follow-up? Because I see a real need for support for parents. Mm-hmm. How do we support one another to talk to our kids and have the courage to do the things we need to do in the school system? You know, if we can't afford Catholic school, for instance, mm-hmm. Or if that's not what we're called to in some sense, or even to be able to stand up in the Catholic school system, because we know that there's, opposition everywhere. So just curious to hear, what does follow-up look like? What would you recommend, and what kind of resources are there?
Yeah, well, the first step, believe it or not, is being willing to kind of stand up and express your conviction. And I always point out to people, you'll be surprised when someone says something about a male swimmer in a female event, and you say, all you have to say is like, That's not fair. And you will be surprised by how many people agree with you. There are a lot of people who have been touched by this. There are a lot of people who instinctivly are uneasy with it, or maybe they think that's someone else's kid, but they worry when it's their own kid. You know, I just think it's important just to be open and to say, you know, that is just so harmful. I can't believe anybody would do that to a kid, and be unafraid to say that. But we're so, and this goes back to the totalitarian nature of what's going on. We're so afraid to speak up. There are a lot of different areas where we need to start working together. I didn't even talk really about the influence of pornography. You know, I spoke to someone at one point whose child was pulled into this at a shockingly early age based on exposure to pornography. So there's a lot of different things that are pulling our kids into it. But start small, start with a small group, people you can talk to, and piece by piece, just start radiating it out there. And I've gotten to the point where I am just, I'll just tell people, because I don't care. I'm just, like, I'm at the point now, I truly don't care. You're in a different position. You have to worry about your, you know, we need you as a mental health therapist, so you probably need to be more prudent, but there are a lot of other people out here who can be a little bit more candid. Someone brings it up and you say, that is really harmful. That is so harmful. I can't believe they do that to kids. And I think you'll be surprised by how many people agree with you, right? Because we're acting, and that's like, just like in the pro-life movement, we didn't make any headway with the fight against abortion until we began to reveal the reality of what was going on with that unborn child, whether it was the gruesome nature of the abortion, or better yet, the humanity of the child that was in the womb. We almost had to have a window on the procedure. And right now we're in a situation where people are using euphemisms: top surgery, bottom surgery, gender affirming care. Don't use euphemisms. Go right to the reality of what's going on. As far as building a circle, we absolutely have to do it. We have to support each other, because our kids need to have, you need to have friends who you can trust, where you can send your kids to play with other kids and not have to worry about the dad coming home in a dress, right? So you've got to cultivate that, and I think it's got to start with networking in the parish. And unfortunately, I don't think we've figured that out yet. So I've been in different parishes around, you know, throughout our life, and some parishes did better than others. I remember speaking at one parish. It was this tiny little parish in central Pennsylvania, and the pastor would, when kids were doing CCD, he had them all do it at the same time, and he would bring in a speaker and have coffee for the parents. And he was very strict to the speaker. He said, you've got 20 minutes. That's it, because these people need 20 minutes to talk and socialize. And so what he was doing was building that kind of community. And we've got to recover that. I can't tell you how many times I cringe. I'll be at a Catholic school and you're at a soccer game and they lock the playground or something like that. Like, oh, come on. You've got to look at this as everything is that opportunity to evangelize, to build that community, to bring in young families and to support them. But unfortunately, I don't think we've grappled with the reality of it yet, and I certainly don't think that we've dealt with the reality of how to reach young people, young families, young professionals. You know, I was just talking to my daughter the other day who was trying to make a Mass on All Saints Day, and she was so frustrated. She was like, Mom, why are all the Masses on All Saints Day at 9 o'clock in the morning? If you're working, you can't get to it. This is why young people don't go to church, because there are no Masses for them, because we're essentially like ministering to an older church and leaving our young kids along the way. So I don't think I answered your question. I think the long and the short of it is that if you look to the church to set something up, to the individual parish to set something up, it's not going to happen because they're overwhelmed. But it is something that has to happen. It has to happen for our families in public school. It has to happen for our families in Catholic schools. And as I mentioned with the school districts in Loudoun County, Virginia, the reason why they were so successful was because those people were sitting at the kitchen table with each other, having coffee and developing strategies. They were friends with each other before they went to the battle. And that's what we've got to have.